So yesterday, I had an opportunity to assist at a wedding in a Catholic church. So Mass of Holy Matrimony, Sacrament of Matrimony, their tradition. And so I went over Friday and for the rehearsal, and was able to talk to the priest prior, and the priest was about 12 years old, it seemed like. So we got along just fine. So we practiced the wedding and we did our thing, and everything was good. And then for the wedding yesterday, Saturday, we met in the back there. They had a back room. It's officially called something in the Catholic Church, and I forget. What is it? Sacristy. Yeah, that's it, sacristy. And so we were back there, and he threw a wild card. There was going to be a deacon with us, so we had practiced that. A deacon and the priest and myself. And so what happens is the wedding's about to start, and he says, "Okay, Pastor John, you lead us out." I was like, "I'm leading us out? Great." And so it's all from a diagonal spot. So I walk out. I'm so concerned about getting to my right spot, to the right of the priest when we get out here. And I come down the steps, and I start to turn to make sure I'm in the right spot. And the priest and the deacon had properly stopped and faced the altar and were about to genuflect. And so I freaked out. And I'm already messing up. So I stumbled back up the steps. And then I did a half bow, half something, because they were already getting up. And I'm friends with the bride's family, very, very close friends with the bride's family and the bride. They were embarrassed. So then I was nervous the rest of the wedding, and I had to do the prayers of intercessory, which, I walked over, the priest said they'd be right here on the podium, and so I got over there, they weren't there. They were underneath something, but I found them, and I went through the prayers, and I was doing fine until I said, "We pray to the world," instead of "we pray to the Lord." And so I was embarrassed yet again. But it was still a beautiful wedding. Beautiful wedding. And I have great respect for the Mass. And it's a beautiful expression when it comes to marriage or the actual wedding ceremony. And I was very concerned at the rehearsal to make sure I had asked all the proper questions, and I wanted to make sure I was wearing the right thing. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. And we had some great conversations, the priest and I. And part of that is, thinking in terms of, for lack of a better way to put it, I was going to his house, and it's the Lord's house, but I was going to his territory. I've worked with priests here in our parish, but I was going to his church in Gettysburg. And so I was very concerned to be respectful of his traditions and the traditions of the church. And I respected that. So I was very, very disappointed in myself that I messed that up. But we didn't practice it. But being in somebody's house, somebody else's house, somebody else's rules, somebody else's guidelines, being a guest, I was a guest. For the kids here in the sanctuary, you're thinking of going to a friend's house. And you have your own rules with your own parents, but when you go to your friend's house, it's important to understand their guidelines and their rules and their boundaries too. Number one, so you'll be invited back, right? And then also to keep you safe in some place that you're not used to being. And so thinking about those two illustrations of living that out is a good way to approach this series, Unto Caesar. We have to remember The New Testament view. So last week we looked at what Jesus said. Today we're looking at what Paul says. Next week we're looking at what Peter said from 3 different New Testament texts. The New Testament worldview of how they approached Caesar was that of a guest. If you need some framework there, think of the words of Jesus that we just had during Holy Week, when Jesus is having the conversation with Pilate, who was working for Caesar, the governor there. Jesus says, "My kingdom is not from this world. If it were, my people would fight. My kingdom is not from this world." And so the worldview that the New Testament is being shaped in is a view that we are guests on this earth, that our kingdom is of heaven, and Jesus is our King. Jesus is Lord over all of our lives. And so when we approach these readings, we have to keep that at the forefront, is that we're guests. And we're trying to navigate this life here and now and to live out God's world and to have some benefit here. But ultimately, at the end of the day, Jesus is our Caesar. And so it's a little bit different than the Old Testament view. That's why we just concentrated on 3 New Testament texts. In the Old Testament, it started out that way. Ultimately, God was supposed to be their king. Remember, God never wanted the Old Testament. He didn't want the Israelites to have a king. Remember that? He's like, "I'm your king." But reluctantly, as the story unfolds, they get their wish because they want to be like everybody else and get a king. But even in that sense, the king was set up as a theocracy. And so the king was an agent of God directly. So it's a little bit different. As we move into the New Testament, we're talking about the Roman Empire. We're talking about the Caesars that were over the empire, and how these new expressions of faith, or the expression of the faith in terms of Christianity, was going to live out as guests in a land here and now. And then we're going to see if we can, through these 3 weeks, and the middle week being today, if we can glean some insight on how it is that we're supposed to navigate our public life here and now as well. And so we're looking specifically at Paul. And just quickly, right after a 15-minute introduction, quickly, just a couple real quick reminders about Paul, or maybe you're hearing that for the first time, but just we're trying to figure out his framework for writing this letter to the Romans. A couple things just to keep in mind. Remember, Paul was born, raised, nurtured, trained as a terrific Jewish person, to the point where as the church was being formed, he was right there at the forefront of persecuting Christians. And he was one of the best and proud, quote unquote, proud of it, one of the best of the faith. Paul was also a Roman citizen. And so he has that in his backdrop. That is part of who he is. He was a Roman citizen. And then, back then, in the first century, you could be a citizen in one of 3 ways. By birth, much like we are, you could live in a land that had been conquered, and you'd have opportunities to become a citizen by that. Or you could be rewarded for service to Rome. You could become a citizen that way. Well, Paul was born and raised as a citizen of Rome. With that, you received some rights. You had a right, theoretically, you were safe from the death penalty. You had a right to make contracts, and you had some other rights as well. You had a right to arrange legal contracted marriages, which is important for us dads today, dads and daughters. We like to think about arranged marriages as well. I just need everybody's way. I have 4. If the price is right. I'm totally kidding. I'm much more concerned about who marries my boys, because they are becoming more and more like me every day. So I want to warn those girls. So anyway, we digress. With the rights came some responsibilities, and one of the biggest responsibilities, not much different than today, the biggest responsibility, pay taxes. So if you were a citizen pay taxes was a responsibility. And over again, in and behind the backdrop of these stories, taxes are a key. Funny that tomorrow our taxes are due. That takes us back to last week. If Jesus would just only said, no, you don't have to pay taxes to Caesar. Man, wouldn't that be a great way to live out our faith today, right? But no, Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar, and God what is God's. There's an element of that here. We heard in Linda's reading something about taxes as well. And so it's a big deal still, because the generation right before Paul, or part of this generation, actually the Caesar before. So right now when Paul's writing, just for a lack of a better way to put it, let's just say 50 AD. That's not exactly right, but the middle of the first century, there was an emperor called Nero, N-E-R-O, Nero. And Nero's interesting because Nero's going to end up being one of the all-time worst in terms of emperors, or whatever they call them, Caesars, of the Roman Empire. He's going to terrorize Christians as we get closer to the end of his reign. That's where we get the book of Revelation from. And so you want to think about Romans 13. If you turn to Revelation 13, it's basically the complete opposite of this. And that's where Nero is terrorizing Christians. But in the beginning, when Nero takes the reign, he is very much hands-off. In fact, supportive of people of faith. He invites Jewish folks back to Rome. The previous emperor had expelled them because they weren't paying taxes and there was a rebellion. So that's where the taxes come from, in other words. So Paul, first and foremost, on his mind, he's dealing with a time where the emperor is okay with them. And so he's saying, hey, pay your taxes. Because basically another way to think about church and state relations in the first century is it was a roller coaster. But this is a time when we say things are good for the people of faith, basically what it means is if you don't cause a scene or a rebellion or anything in between, the Caesar will leave you alone. So it's not great, it's not gravy, but they will be left alone if they pay their taxes and they don't make a public scene. And so that's where we are. And so that's where we get this writing. So Paul's in a pretty good place. Every person should place themselves under the authority of the government. There isn't any authority unless it comes from God. And we go on from there. Now here's the point, and here's one of the reasons we included this passage in Scripture, or in the series. It's so plain. In our English translation, this is not poetry. This is not apocalyptic type reading that we get from Revelation or part of Daniel. I mean, this is, in our English, is pretty clear. It's pretty clear what Paul is saying. We don't have to really decipher what the words mean. But that reminds us of the great Mark Twain quote. It ain't those parts of the Bible that I can't understand that bother me. It's the parts that I do understand. Amen? So we can all relate to that. It's the plain, it's just plain language. We get it. We know exactly, we don't have to guess what Paul's saying. Now we have to figure out how are we going to live it out? How are we going to deal with it, I'll say. And so over the history of the church, for 2,000 years, we've dealt with it in a couple different ways. Most of the time, we have completely ignored it. Completely ignored it. And so you would rarely ever hear it in a church, for example, being read to you. A lot of churches across traditions, Presbyterian, Catholic, Methodist, whatever, will use something called the Revised Common Lectionary, which is a 3-year cycle of readings. It's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. And what it does is it gives you a complete survey of the Scriptures. It forces you not to get stuck on your favorite Scriptures, but to use all of them. And not literally all of them, but all the major parts of the Bible. So it's a good thing. And then each tradition sometimes will have a variation on any particular Sunday. But basically, a reading in a Methodist church, a normal Methodist church, we're not a normal Methodist church. It used to be normal until we came. Just kidding. but we're not normal when it comes to, we preach series and we pick our own scriptures. But for example, any given Sunday here at the Presbyterian Church in California, it would all be similar readings. None of them include Romans 13. Just completely ignore it. So that's one way you can deal with it. Completely ignore it. Number two is you can completely abuse it or use it to abuse people. Think how easy it would be as a preacher, me, or as a teacher, you, or whatever, to hold people down with this and say, because of their class, socioeconomic class, because of their race, because of any other status other than just being a free human being, you could use this to say, hey, Cindy, we like exactly where you are. Don't think about going anywhere else because we're the government and we're telling you to. And besides, the Bible says so. Then you got to listen to us. And so you can see where that would be used, and it has been in our history and history all around the world. It has been used to abuse people, and so that's another way we could approach Romans 13. When it falls in those two camps, it's pretty easy to figure out how you and I are to read Romans 13. And so, for example, here's what I mean by that. If Caesar is pretty good to us, if Caesar's on our side, it's easy to live that passage out. We know exactly what it means when it says all authority is from God. We can say, hey, yeah, the king's being pretty good to us. The president's being pretty good to us. The governor, he's pretty cool to Christians and vice versa. Have a pretty good working relationship. Absolutely, guys and gals, submit to that authority. And so when we have that kind of working relationship between church and state, then it's a pretty good thing and pretty easy to figure out how to go about it. I'll give an example from our Methodist history. Is Kay here? Kay's here. Our Methodist and our English history. And so, Kay, don't correct me out loud. You can pull me aside and say I was wrong. So, just kidding. If I get the kings messed up. But anyway, so John Wesley was working in the mid to late 1700s. So the late 18th century, mid to late 18th century. And he was a priest in the Church of England until the day he died. He never intended on starting a new church. He was very, very loyal to the monarchy. Very supportive and loyal. And there's a lot into that statement, but crystal clear, very loyal to the king. He was also very concerned about the marginalized, taking care of the poor and the imprisoned and the people in debt and preaching to the minors. And so all that is working together, or intention or whatever, it doesn't matter. But all that's part of who he was. But as this revival that he was a part of, this Methodist movement, was getting geared up, his colleagues in the Church of England, so his fellow priests in the Church of England, were threatened by him and the insurrection, quote unquote, that he was generating. And so they wanted him to stop. They didn't like that he was going out of the building to preach, number one. He didn't like that he was preaching good news to the poor. I just read a book by Wesley called Good News to the Poor, or about Wesley. But anyways, they didn't like all that. And so what they did was, these colleagues, they appealed to the king. They appealed to the king. They wanted the king, who's the head of the church, to stop Wesley and end it. And so we're talking about King George II. And if I'm wrong, Kay, it's because the internet's wrong. So this is a quote from Wesley. God stirred up the heart of our late gracious sovereign George II to give such orders to his magistrates as, being put in execution, effectually quelled the madness of the people. It was about the same time that a great man applied personally to his majesty, begging that he would please take a course to stop these runabout preachers. His Majesty, looking sternly upon him, answered without ceremony, like a king. I tell you, while I sit on the throne, no man shall be persecuted for conscience sake. And so what this did was it gave protection by the king to the Methodists. It granted them protection, equal protection under the law. And if you would go on to read some more from Wesley, very colorful and loving, for lack of a better way, language about the king, especially King George II and his father as well. And so what happens is it was both ways, great support to the king and vice versa. And an extraordinary act of the king, who's head of the Church of England, to go against the general consensus and to give Wesley room with his rogue preachers, room and opportunity for this revival. And so in this case, you can see where Wesley would read the way Wesley would read Romans 13. So even in the midst of revival, even in the midst of preaching to the poor and the imprisoned, he'd be preaching, hey, we need to love and support the king as well. The king is in place because of God. And so that's how it would play out there. And so that would be an easy thing for Wesley to preach, especially after getting that level of support from the monarchy. Now let's look at the flip side of that. In this passage, Romans 13, do we think about blindly assenting to genocide? So if the king would have ordered genocide, do you think Wesley wouldn't have turned suddenly? So no, you don't use this passage to blindly follow any leader. That would go against, genocide, for example, would go against the commandments of the Bible. And so, thou shalt not murder, for example. Is this passage saying that if the king or queen asks you to denounce God before others? Of course not. And we have a whole biblical tradition of where, like Daniel, refused to bow down to the king, and so on and so forth. Apostle Paul eventually is going to be martyred. Peter's going to be martyred. They're all going to be martyred. Jesus didn't bow down to Caesar. And so it's of course not the way that you would read that as well. And so when we have extremes to that case, on the other side, listen to these words. The time is fulfilled for the German people of Hitler. It is because of Hitler that Christ, God the Helper and Redeemer, has become effective among us. Hitler is the way of the Spirit and the will of God for the German people to enter the Church of Christ. That's from a German pastor, a Lutheran pastor named Hermann Gruner. Another pastor put it more succinctly. Christ has come to us through Adolf Hitler. So, if you're in Germany at that time, or anywhere in the world for that matter, but in Germany at that time, when Hitler is rising, and you're part of the established church in Germany, which was the Lutheran church at the time, then certainly it alarms us that there were pastors, leaders in the church that were using Romans 13 in that way. They were saying not only follow what Hitler's saying, but bow down to him. He's the supreme authority that God has sent us. And so you can see how they would read that. Thankfully, though, and that's a very comfortable place to be. The established church is a very comfortable place to be. And it doesn't have to be officially. Like unofficially, Christianity has been the established religion of America, founded under God. But there's no, we have that actually in the Constitution where the government can establish a church. And so what they mean is we can't have a Church of England or like the Lutheran Church was at that time. That we have freedom to live out our faith however we may live it out. But it's very comfortable for those Lutheran pastors, because what was happening for them, the ones that we read the quote from, what was happening with them is basically what we experienced in the first century stuff. Basically, Hitler would leave us alone. they were thinking. As long as we don't cause any trouble, we can go about the business of our church and our faith, and they do it in an extreme way. But thankfully, not everybody saw it that way in terms of leadership in the church. This is where we get the great traditions and history of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You ever heard of Bonhoeffer? Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor during this time, and he didn't allow Romans 13 to stand in the way of reform and rebellion against Hitler. And so he led in a very dramatic way. He ends up being sent to a concentration camp and killed. But all along the way, he's trying to reform and to institute rebellion or incite rebellion through his writings, through his preaching, and through his action. He becomes a double spy, and he's trying to basically have Hitler assassinated. And so that's how he's arrested. But Bonhoeffer would be an example of saying, hey, no, wait a minute. We don't blindly follow this leader based on this passage. This leader is not from God. This is not what the Apostle Paul had in mind when he said every person should place themselves under the authority of government. And so what happens is, unfortunately,